Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Answering Fundamentalism, where we pull back the curtain on the myths, half-truths, and historical revisionism that I was taught to never question growing up in fundamentalist Baptist circles. Today, we're in part 2 of our series, Breaking Down the Trail of Blood, which is that infamous little booklet that claims to trace an unbroken line of Baptist churches from the time of John the Baptist and Jesus to your local landmark congregation. In our previous episode, we took a look at the Montanists, who were a 2nd century prophetic sect that Landmarkists will often co-opt into their Baptist lineage. And they do this because they claim the Montanists were outside the institutional church and that they rejected infant baptism and baptismal regeneration. But as we saw in that previous episode, the Montanists were not rejecting Catholic theology. In fact, they were trying to out-Catholic the Catholics. Tertullian, who was their most famous supporter, still believed in things such as apostolic succession, the authority of bishops, baptismal regeneration, and the real presence in the Eucharist. And that part about infant baptism, the Montanists did not object to infant baptism. They just had a preference for delaying baptism as long as possible. And they had this preference because they believed that baptism wiped away all sins, saved the recipient, but that serious post-baptismal sins were unforgivable. So if you baptized the baby and they went on to commit, let's say, idolatry, then they were toast. And that's not Baptist doctrine, that's spiritual perfectionism. And they ordained women as preachers and prophets. So unless your local landmark congregation is willing to host a Montanist women's revival, we should probably stop pretending these people were proto-Baptists. But the trail doesn't stop there. Today we're moving into the 3rd and 4th centuries to discuss 2 more groups that are often looped into this trail of blood myth, the Novatians and the Donatists. Beginning with the Novatians, let's rewind to the year 250 AD, when Roman Emperor Decius unleashed the most disruptive persecution that the early church had faced up to that point. Unlike earlier, more sporadic crackdowns, this wasn't just local or reactionary. Decius issued an empire-wide edict that required all Roman citizens to perform an act of public worship to the pagan gods. To prove compliance, citizens were required to offer a sacrifice to the Roman deities, and in exchange they received a certificate called a libellus. But for Christians, this wasn't just politics, it was apostasy on paper, and refusal meant imprisonment, torture, or death. The first martyr during the Decian persecution was the Bishop of Rome, Pope Fabian, who was executed in January of 250. The early church historian Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, wrote, "Fabian, who was wonderfully illustrious for the manner of his death, suffered martyrdom at this time." Apparently, Emperor Decius made a strategic decision to go after the most important figure in the church first. And we see this in the following statement that he made as recorded by Cyprian, who at the time was the Bishop of Carthage. Decius stated that he would far rather receive news of a rival to the throne than of another bishop of Rome. In the wake of Fabian's death, there were various priests in Rome, including a priest named Novatian, who helped govern the church. But not everyone stood firm. Some Christians capitulated either by offering the pagan sacrifice or bribing public officials in exchange for fake certificates. And this group became collectively known as the Lapsi, or those who had lapsed in their faith. When the persecution ended the following year, the church found itself in a moral and pastoral crisis. The question was, what do we do with the Lapsi? Can they be readmitted to the church through penance, or have they forfeited their salvation forever? In 251 AD, the Roman clergy elected Cornelius as Fabian's replacement as the Bishop of Rome, and this was much to the disappointment of Novatian, who had expected to be named as Fabian's replacement. Regarding how to handle the Lapsi, Cornelius took the more pastoral approach, believing they could be restored to communion after sincere repentance and penance. But this wasn't cheap grace. This was a process of public contrition which sometimes lasted years before they were allowed to receive the Eucharist again. But not everyone agreed. Novatian argued that the church had no authority to forgive grave post-baptismal sins. In his view, which echoed the view of Tertullian and the Montanists, who we discussed in the previous video, baptism was a one-time cleansing. If you failed in a very serious way after that, then your salvation was lost forever. But Novatian didn't just protest. He had himself illegitimately consecrated as a rival bishop of Rome, which made him one of the earliest recorded antipopes in church history. Eusebius records this event in his ecclesiastical history, where he includes the following words from Dionysius, the bishop of Alexandria. For this dogmatist, this defender of the doctrine of the church, attempting to grasp and seize the episcopate, which had not been given him from above, chose two of his companions who had given up their own salvation. And he sent them to a small and insignificant corner of Italy, that there by some counterfeit argument he might deceive three bishops, who were rustic and very simple men. And they asserted positively and strongly that it was necessary that they should come quickly to Rome, in order that all the dissension which had arisen there might be appeased through their mediation, jointly with other bishops. When they had come, being, as we have stated, very simple in the craft and artifice of the wicked, they were shut up with certain selected men like himself. And by the 10th hour, when they had become drunk and sick, he compelled them by force to confer on him the episcopate through a counterfeit and vain imposition of hands. Because it had not come to him, he avenged himself by craft and treachery. His followers broke away and formed a separate, rigorous sect claiming to be the true church. And this is a pattern that will sound very familiar to anyone raised hearing the Trail of Blood ideology. Novatian then tried to take full control of the church by appointing new bishops and sees all over the Roman Empire. And this is one of the earliest proofs of the general acceptance of the authority of the Bishop of Rome as the Pope to appoint or approve bishops anywhere in the world. And that's the controversy that gave birth to Novatianism. The early church responded swiftly to Novatianism. A synod of 60 bishops held in Rome later that year excommunicated Novatian and his followers. And this is an action affirmed by Cyprian of Carthage, Dionysius of Alexandria, and other leading bishops throughout the empire. So why do Landmarkist Baptists claim the Novatians as part of their trail of blood? Let's look at what some of their authors say in their own writings. G.H. Orchard, author of A Concise History of Baptists, writes, "One Novatian, a presbyter in the Church of Rome, strongly opposed the readmission of apostates, but he was not successful. The choice of a pastor in the same church fell upon Cornelius, whose election Novatian opposed, from his readiness to readmit apostates. Novatian consequently separated himself from the church and from Cornelius's jurisdiction. Novatian, with every considerate person, was disgusted with the hasty admission of such apostates to communion, and with the conduct of many pastors, who were more concerned about numbers than purity of communion. J.M. Carroll in The Trail of Blood declared that when the errors of compromised local church autonomy, infant baptism, and baptismal regeneration crept into the churches, the Novatian Baptists sallied forth for the cause of ecclesiastical purity. He wrote, some of the churches vigorously repudiated them, so much so that in AD 251, the loyal churches declared non-fellowship for those churches which accepted and practiced these errors. And thus came about the first real official separation among the churches. Thomas Armitage observed in A History of Baptists, the Novatians demanded pure churches which enforced strict discipline, and so were called Puritans. Berlin Heisel, in his Baptist History Notebook, states, Novatian and his followers believed a church was to be pure. Baptismal regeneration and infant baptism would surely place into the church lost people, and a pure church could not be maintained. So this perspective suggests that the Novatians rejected practices like infant baptism and baptismal regeneration, which aligned them with Baptist principles. And he will go on to state in the same writing, we have noticed at length what the Novatian churches believed about church discipline and purity of the church. None can doubt but that they believed in a regenerated church membership. Since everyone at this early date believed in and practiced immersion, they immersed for baptism. Since infant baptism was almost unheard of, they rejected it. From these observations alone, we conclude they were Baptists. So essentially, the claim being made is that the Novatians were a separate, pure church which was free from Catholic principles, and they rejected practices such as infant baptism, baptismal regeneration, in favor of believers' baptism through immersion, which had no salvific effect. At first glance, this sounds very familiar to modern Baptist distinctives. So what's the problem? The problem is that none of these claims hold up under scrutiny. Let's actually look at these claims one by one. So let's look at the first claim, which is that the Novatians separated from Rome because Rome was doctrinally corrupt. This is pure conjecture. Novatian never claimed that the Roman Catholic Church had adopted heretical doctrines, only that it had compromised in the way it handled the lapsy. He didn't object to its doctrine, he objected to its discipline. Specifically, Novatian was outraged that the church was willing to readmit those who had denied Christ under persecution and welcomed them back into the church once they had repented. To frame that as a rejection of doctrinal corruption is not just misleading, it's dishonest. We actually have hard evidence of what the Novatians believed, and it proves that their theology lined up with that of the Catholic Church. Here's where the history becomes undeniable, but first let's frame the context. The Nicene Creed was written at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, primarily to combat Arianism and other forms of Christological and Trinitarian heresies. It affirms the full divinity of Christ, the Trinity, the four marks of the church, which is just that the true church of Jesus Christ is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, and it also affirms the one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. It was and still is today the foundational statement of Catholic orthodoxy. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica. It made Nicene Christianity, aka Catholicism, the official religion of the Roman Empire, and it also outlawed heresies such as Arianism. So it cemented Catholic doctrine as state orthodoxy. The 4th century writer Sozomen recounts how Emperor Constantine summoned a Novatian bishop named Asius to come before the Council of Nicaea and answer for their separation from the broader church. It is related that the emperor, under the impulse of an ardent desire to see harmony reestablished among Christians, summoned Asius, bishop of the Church of the Novatians, to the council, placed before him the definition of the faith and of the feast, which had already been confirmed by the signatures of the bishops, and asked whether he could agree thereto. Asius answered that their exposition defined no new doctrine, and that he accorded an opinion with the synod, and that he had from the beginning held these sentiments with respect both to the faith and to the feast. Why then, said the emperor, do you keep aloof from communion with others, if you are of one mind with them? He replied that the dissension first broke out under Decius between Novatius and Cornelius, and that he considered such persons unworthy of communion who, after baptism, had fallen into those sins which the scriptures declare to be unto death. So here we have one of the leading bishops of the Novatian Church admitting that the Nicene Creed was completely orthodox, and the only disagreement between the Novatians and the Catholic Church was on how they viewed the lapsi. In 383 AD, Emperor Theodosius issued an edict which required all non-Nicene sects, including Arians, Anomians, Macedonians, and the Novatians, to submit written creeds. And then after he had read each one, he burned all of them except for the Novatian Creed. Why did he not burn the Novatian Creed? Because it aligned with Nicene Christianity, the official orthodoxy of the Catholic Church. Historian William Kenneth Boyd wrote the following. In 383 AD, the emperor ordered the various non-Nicene sects, Arians, Anomians, Macedonians, and Novatians, to submit written creeds to him, which he prayerfully reviewed and then burned, save for that of the Novatians who also supported Nicene Christianity. The other sects lost the right to meet, ordain priests, or spread their beliefs. Let's let that sink in. The Novatian Creed wasn't just tolerated, it was spared and honored because it affirmed the doctrines of the Catholic Church. So if the Novatians were really protesting doctrinal corruption, they had an extremely funny way of showing it by affirming the exact same doctrines the Catholic Church did. Protestant church historian Philip Schaff, in his History of the Christian Church, confirms, Novatian, the second Roman antipope, Hippolytus being probably the first, orthodox in doctrine but schismatic in discipline, and in both respects closely resembling Hippolytus and Tertullian, flourished in the middle of the 3rd century and became the founder of a sect called after his name. Sozomen, again in his Ecclesiastical History, wrote, about this period the Novatians of Phrygia, contrary to their ancient custom, began to celebrate the festival of the Passover on the same day as the Jews. Novatius, the originator of this heresy, refused to receive those who repented of their sins into communion, and it was in this respect alone that he innovated upon the established doctrine. So the Novatians didn't break away because Rome taught false doctrines. They broke away because Rome preached forgiveness. Okay, so let's look at the second claim, which is that the Novatians had an autonomous and congregational structure led by pastors and deacons like Baptists do. Fundamentalist Baptists believe that the local church is an independent and democratic body where every member has a say and carries equal weight. This does not rule out cooperation and consultation with like-minded churches. It just means that in the end, the local church makes its own decisions. The problem with this claim is that there is zero evidence of this being the case with the Novatians. Novatian himself was consecrated as a bishop, and his followers continued to operate with an episcopal polity, with bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Remember that in 250 AD, Novatian stepped into the breach when Pope Fabian was martyred, and in this capacity, he corresponded with other churches on behalf of the church at Rome. He was on friendly and cordial terms with Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage at this time. In a letter to Cyprian, Novatian agreed that once the persecution ended, a council should be convened to discuss and determine what should be done with those who had lapsed from the faith. However, what you also have yourself declared in so important a manner is satisfactory to us, that the peace of the church must first be maintained, then that an assembly for council being gathered together with bishops, presbyters, deacons, and confessors, as well as with the laity who stand fast, we should deal with the case of the lapsed. Notice here how the polity contains bishops and presbyters and deacons. That's an Episcopal model, not the pastor-deacon model that the fundamentalist Baptists who make these claims follows. Furthermore, Novatian believed that a decision should only be made after close consultation with men from other churches. Look upon almost the whole world devastated and observe that the remains and the ruins of the fallen are lying about on every side, and consider that therefore an extent of counsel is asked for, large in proportion as the crime appears to be widely propagated. Keep in mind that J.M. Carroll warned readers of the Trail of Blood that if they found a church which didn't hold to a series of identifiable marks, this is a false church. Among these marks, he wrote, "The churches and their government and discipline to be entirely separate and independent of each other. Jerusalem to have no authority over Antioch, nor Antioch over Ephesus, nor Ephesus over Corinth," and so forth. "And their government to be congregational, democratic, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people." If this is the case, then Landmarkists should stop claiming Novatians as their forefathers. After the Decian persecution ended, Cyprian held his own council in North Africa, as did Cornelius in Rome. By this time, Cornelius had already been elected as the Bishop of Rome, and Novatian had split from the church. Pay attention to the corporate decision-making process that took place in Cyprian's North African Council. The advice gathered from the comparison of all opinions being communicated and weighed, we might determine what was necessary to be done. But if anyone, before our council and before the opinion decided upon by the advice of all, should rashly wish to communicate with the lapsed, he himself should be withheld from communion. Novatian agreed with the idea of a cooperative council to decide what was to be done with the lapsed. Cornelius later held a council in Rome to formulate that policy. There is no concept of the autonomy of local churches. Instead, we see a distinctly Episcopal ecclesiology. Protestant historian Philip Schaff, again in his History of the Christian Church, confirms the Novatians and the Meletians likewise had the Episcopal form of organization. So Schaff attests that the Novatians maintained Episcopal organization. The third claim is that the Novatians were proto-Baptists because they held the same views on baptism as modern-day Baptists, which is they reject infant baptism, they baptize through full immersion, and they don't believe that baptism saves. Let's restate the quote that I read earlier from Landmarkist historian Berlin Heisel. He states, "Novatian and his followers believed a church was to be pure. Baptismal regeneration and infant baptism would surely place into the church lost people, and a pure church cannot be maintained." Dave Benedict was an early 19th century secessionist writer who cited the Novatian practice of rebaptizing those who left the Catholic Church to join them, and he concluded that they were, of course, Baptists. The problem with these claims regarding baptism is that the Novatians rejected every single one of these propositions. Let's discuss each of these claims regarding baptism individually. On the topic of infant baptism, one very important writing that we have from this period is called On the Apostolic Tradition, and it was written by Hippolytus of Rome. And in this writing, he records the practices of the church in Rome during the early 3rd century. Remember that the Decian persecution and the subsequent Novatian schism took place in the early to late 250s AD. Therefore, Apostolic Traditions is a very important resource for understanding how the church in Rome operated during Novatian's day. And it is a fact that they practiced infant baptism. You are to baptize the little ones first. All those who are able to speak for themselves should speak. With regard to those who cannot speak for themselves, their parents or somebody who belongs to their family should speak. Then baptize the grown men and finally the women, after they have let down their hair and laid down the gold and silver ornaments which they have on them. Nobody should take any alien object down into the water. This snapshot of church polity in Rome around the time of Novatian demonstrates that the church in Rome practiced infant baptism. Little ones were to be baptized before adults. These little ones were divided into those who could speak for themselves and those who could not. The little ones were members of a family who were all being baptized together. And so this mimics the household baptisms that we see in the books of Acts and Corinthians. Unless a critic is willing to explain away the baptism of these little ones, or even argue that Novatian secretly disagreed with this practice in his own church, where he was already acknowledged as an established leader, then it is a fact that the church in Rome practiced infant baptism. On the topic of immersion, Novatian himself was baptized by effusion, or pouring. He was sick and near death and was baptized upon his sick bed. Eusebius recorded a now lost epistle from Pope Cornelius to this effect. He says, "But Satan, who entered and dwelt in him for a long time, became the occasion of his believing. Being delivered by the exorcists, he fell into a severe sickness, and as he seemed about to die, he received baptism by effusion on the bed where he lay." Now, a well-read Landmarkist, if those exist, might object to this argument by pointing out that Novatian's baptism was considered irregular by his contemporaries. And while it is true that his baptism was considered irregular, it's not because he received baptism by pouring. It's because he did not receive the imposition of hands after baptism by a bishop. Eusebius goes on to write how Pope Cornelius criticized Novatian because of this. "And when he was healed of his sickness, he did not receive the other things which it is necessary to have according to the canon of the church, even the being sealed by the bishop. And as he did not receive this, how could he receive the Holy Spirit?" Notice how Cornelius didn't even mention the fact that Novatian had received baptism by pouring, and instead his sole focus was on the fact that Novatian didn't receive the imposition of hands. On the topic of baptismal regeneration, Novatian defends this doctrine in his own writings. In his writing on the Trinity, he states, "In baptism and in the dissolution of death, the flesh is raised up and returns to salvation, by being recalled to the condition of innocency when the mortality of guilt is put away." Novatian goes on to state, "He it is who effects with water the second birth as a certain seed of divine generation, and a consecration of a heavenly nativity, the pledge of a promised inheritance, and as it were a kind of handwriting of eternal salvation." In Novatian's writing on Jewish meats, he states, "There is no advantage at all of righteousness, while we are recalled by a voluntary slavery to those elements to which by baptism we have died." So Novatian is affirming in his own writing that baptism forgives sins, brings about the second birth that Jesus mentions in John 3:5, and brings us to salvation. So yes, Novatian believed that baptism saves. Protestant scholar and church historian Everett Ferguson wrote probably the most in-depth book on baptism in the first 5 centuries of the church. And in this book, he dedicates a portion to discussing Novatian's views on baptism. He states the following: "Novatian held to the same Trinitarian faith as the majority in the Roman Church did, and he used the same baptismal symbol, which are the questions asked during the rite of baptism. His baptismal doctrine also was the same. In baptism and in the resurrection, the flesh is raised up to salvation by being restored to innocence when the mortality of guilt is removed." So to summarize, we have demonstrated that the church at Rome practiced infant baptism in Novatian's day, that Novatian himself was baptized by pouring, not immersion, and his baptism wasn't simply a public expression of his newfound faith. It was done in private upon a sick bed for his salvation. We've demonstrated that Novatian, in his own writings, affirms his belief in baptismal regeneration, or that baptism saves, and that the Novatians believed once you were baptized and saved, if you went on to commit serious sins afterwards, you could lose your salvation and never get it back. Yet Baptists reject the idea that baptism saves and that one can lose their salvation. The bottom line is the Novatians' creed, their sacraments, their theology, and ecclesiology were Catholic. So they weren't Baptists under a different name. They were schismatic Catholics who took a super strict stance on the lapsy, and pretending otherwise isn't history, it's fiction. Let's move on to the second group that we will discuss in today's video, which are the Donatists. Fast forward about 50 years after the Novatian Schism, and we find ourselves in the 4th century, a time that historians refer to as the Great Persecution because it was the most violent and extensive persecution in all of church history. Diocletian, along with his co-emperor Galerius, launched an all-out campaign to stamp out Christianity across the entire Roman Empire. Edicts were issued across the empire demanding that churches be destroyed, scriptures handed over and burned, worship halted, and Christians themselves imprisoned, tortured, and killed if they refused to comply. The emperor's orders were brutally enforced, especially in North Africa, where Roman officials took a special interest in breaking the Christian resistance. The church was torn apart. Some clergy courageously held the line by choosing death over compromise, but others caved under pressure. Some handed over sacred books, and these became known as traditores, or those who handed over. Others offered pagan sacrifices, and these became known as the sacrificati. And some even chose to cooperate with the Roman officials in order to avoid imprisonment or death. So far, this is starting to sound a lot like what happened during the Decian persecution. Once the persecution began to subside, thanks to the Edict of Toleration and the Edict of Milan, a question was raised. What do we do with the clergy who had betrayed the church during the persecution? Were their ordinations still valid? Could they still administer sacraments? Or could they even be considered part of the church? And these questions came to a head in Carthage, which was the leading city in Roman North Africa after Cecilian was elected bishop in 311. Here's the problem. Cecilian had been consecrated as bishop by Felix of Aptunga, who was accused of being a traditor. Allegedly, Felix had handed over copies of the sacred scripture during the Great Persecution, but the charge would later be proven false, as we see in the following quotes. Optatus, addressing Novatian bishop Parmenion, states the following concerning the clearing of Felix. Then Constantine wrote to Aelianus, the proconsul, to lay aside his public duties and make public inquiry into the life of Felix of Optumna. The appointed officer took his seat. The witnesses were Claudius Saturianus, a state commissioner who had been in the city of Felix all through the time of the persecution and had been a commissioner when he was impeached, Clydius Gratianus, and Alpheus Cecilianus, the magistrate. Also, Superius the warder was summoned, and Ingentius the public notary, who was in constant fear of the torture with which he was threatened. By the evidence of all, it was ascertained that there was nothing that could disgrace the life of Felix the bishop. The volume of acts is in existence in which are recorded the names of those who had been present at the trial. Claudius Saturianus the official, and Cecilianus the magistrate, and Superius the warder, and Ingentius the notary, and Solon a public official of the time. After they had given their replies, the above-mentioned proconsul gave his judgment, of which this is a part. That Felix, the holy bishop, is guiltless of having burned the divine books is clear from the fact that no one was able to prove anything against him, neither that he had given up nor burned the most sacred scriptures. For all the above-mentioned witnesses prove clearly that none of the divine writings had been either discovered or injured or burned. It is shown by the acts that the holy bishop Felix was not present at the time, and that he was neither privy to any such crime nor commanded it to be done. And so he left the court, cleared of every stain upon his reputation, and wonderfully praised. Augustine, in letter 88, wrote, Wherefore, having ordered the compearance of Superius, centurion, Cecilianus, magistrate of Aptunga, and Saturninus, the ex-president of police, and his successor in the office, Calibius the younger, and Solon, an official belonging to Aptunga, he heard the testimony of these witnesses. The result of which was that whereas objection had been taken to Cecilianus on the ground of his ordination to the office of bishop by Felix, against whom it seemed that the charge of surrendering and burning the sacred books had been made, the innocence of Felix in this matter was clearly established. As Protestant church historian Philip Schaff comments on this passage from letter 88, the value of the evidence of these witnesses is apparent when we remember that they were all in a position to speak from personal knowledge on the persecution in AD 303 under Diocletian and Maximian, and had in their public capacity some share in enforcing the demand made in that persecution for the surrender of the sacred books. These could tell whether Felix, the bishop of Aptunga, was guilty or not of the unfaithfulness to his religion with which the faction of Majorinus reproached him. Back to the ordination of Cecilian by Felix, who we now know was wrongly accused. This ignited a storm of protest among a coalition of bishops from Numidia who demanded a stricter stance. They declared Cecilian's ordination invalid, and they appointed their own rival bishop in his place, Majorinus. When Majorinus died shortly after, the leadership of this separatist movement passed to Donatus Magnus, which is where the Donatists get their name. The Donatists insisted that the entire Catholic Church had been morally compromised due to its leniency and its association with clergy who had failed under persecution. In their view, apostates and their successors could not validly confer sacraments or lead the faithful. For them, the true church had to be visibly and morally pure, and its ministers had to be free from the taint of betrayal. So let's take a moment to point out the differences between the Novatians and the Donatists. The Novatians focused on the members of the church as a whole, and believed that serious post-baptismal sins were unforgivable, and so the guilty were forever damned. The Donatists focused on the clergy, and more specifically, whether or not the grace-giving sacraments were still valid if administered by someone who had apostatized under persecution. So this was not a doctrinal dispute. This was a disciplinary and ecclesiological divide on the question of, can the church be holy if its ministers are not? The Catholic Church responded decisively to the Donatist schism, and not just with letters and sermons, but through formal councils and excommunications. One of the earliest responses came when the Donatists appealed directly to Emperor Constantine. He summoned a council in Rome in 313 AD, which ruled in favor of Cecilian and rejected the Donatist complaint. This was their first major defeat, but they persisted. In 314 AD, Constantine called a more broadly representative council of Western bishops at Arles in southern Gaul, who again sided with Cecilian and condemned the Donatists as schismatics. And then, almost a century later, as the Donatists persisted, Emperor Honorius called for a public debate in Carthage. This pitted Catholic bishops, led by Augustine, against the Donatist leaders. The final judgment was that the Donatist church was labeled illegitimate, and imperial force was authorized to suppress the movement. And in all of these responses, the Catholic position was clear. A sacrament's validity does not depend on the minister's worthiness. The church must contain saints and sinners until the end of time, and schism over moral rigorism is still schism, and it endangers salvation. So let's summarize what the Donatists believed and why it matters. They believed that the church must be visibly pure and its clergy morally blameless. These are two ideas that no Baptist pastor would agree with today. They also believed that sacraments administered by the traditors were invalid. Yet Baptists don't believe in sacraments, they believe in two ordinances, and they don't think that these ordinances confer grace to the recipient, yet Donatists did. The Donatist movement maintained the episcopal structure, apostolic succession, infant baptism, and sacramental theology, which are all things that Baptists reject. And last but most certainly not least, they believed that those who had betrayed the church during the persecution either had to be rebaptized or, if you were a member of the clergy, reordained. Yet Baptists don't believe that you can lose salvation, and they also don't believe that the sacraments confer grace to the recipient, much less that the validity of the sacrament is dependent upon a morally blameless preacher. Despite the Donatists clearly being a rigorous schism in the early Catholic Church, Landmark Baptists still try to recruit them into the trail of blood. So let's break down their common arguments and put them to the test. The first claim is that the Donatists rejected the corrupt Catholic Church and stood for biblical purity. G.H. Orchard, a key author in Baptist secessionist circles, writes, "The Donatists maintain that the church ought to be made up of just and holy men, or at least of those who are such in appearance, and that although wicked men might lurk in the church, yet it would not harbor those who were known to be such." Orchard goes on to write that the Donatists and Novatianists very nearly resembled each other in doctrines and discipline. This is the core narrative, that the Donatists were the real church standing against a compromised early Roman Catholicism. We just saw one of the most ardent defenders of Landmarkism admit that the Novatians and the Donatists very nearly resembled one another in doctrine and discipline. And we've already shown that the Novatians held to the exact same creed, doctrine, sacraments, and ecclesiology as the Catholic Church, as admitted by their own bishops and official church councils. So the Landmarkist claim that the Donatists were Baptists collapses under its own logic. Augustine wrote a letter to Pope Boniface explaining the difference between the Arians and the Donatists. He starts the letter by stating that the Arians viewed the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as three different substances, but goes on to state that the Donatists reject this view and they accept the one substance in the unity of the Trinity. Then he says, but they carry on their unhappy strife solely on the question of communion, and in the perversity of their error maintain rebellious hostility against the unity of Christ. So according to a Catholic bishop who actively and ferociously wrote against the Donatists, they only differed from the Catholic Church on the question of communion. The second claim is that the Donatists rejected infant baptism in favor of believers' baptism. This claim surfaces more subtly in some Baptist writings and usually by association. So you will see phrases such as they were against sacramental corruption or they believed in a regenerate church. And from that, it's implied that they must have rejected infant baptism. The problem with this claim is that infant baptism was already standard practice in the North African church at this time, and there is zero evidence that the Donatists opposed it. In fact, we know that the Catholic and Donatist churches both practiced infant baptism, because of Augustine's debates with them. Augustine never criticized them for rejecting infant baptism because they didn't. We also know for a fact that the Donatists practiced infant baptism because the Council of Carthage had an entire discussion on how to handle people who wanted to join the Catholic priesthood but were baptized as infants in the Donatist church. Concerning the Donatists, it seemed good that we should hold counsel with our brethren and fellow priests, Siricius and Simplician, concerning those infants alone who are baptized by Donatists, lest what they did not do of their own will, when they should be converted to the Church of God with a salutary determination, the error of their parents might prevent their promotion to the ministry of the Holy Altar. We also know for a fact that the Donatists, just like the Montanists and the Novatians, and frankly every other Christian who existed prior to the 1500s, believed in baptismal regeneration. Here's a quote from Petilian, a Donatist bishop, who was one of their most important leaders early in the movement. What we look for is the conscience of the giver, giving in holiness to cleanse that of the recipient. For he who knowingly receives faith from the faithless receives not faith but guilt. For everything consisting of an origin and root, and if it have not something for a head, it is nothing. Nor does anything well receive second birth unless it is born again of good seed. The true church, Petilian went on to say, was the church that maintained the purity of the sacraments. So what Petilian is arguing is that no one receives the second birth, salvation, unless they are born again of good seed. In other words, baptized by someone not guilty of mortal sin. The third claim made by Landmarkis is that the Donatists were persecuted by the Catholic Church, which just proves they were the true church and, by extension, Baptists. Landmarkis often point to Donatist persecution, especially under Augustine's later support for state suppression once the Donatists became violent, as proof that they were the remnant faithful. And this is one of the big arguments made in the Trail of Blood book, that the true church that Jesus Christ established has always been persecuted by Rome. But as we've pointed out before, persecution alone does not make a group faithful. By that exact same standard, the Gnostics, the Arians, and Muslims are also the true church because they were also persecuted at different points in time. So Landmarkis can't have it both ways, where we treat persecution as the stamp of truth in one case and then we ignore it in all other cases. Moreover, Donatists themselves often acted very violently. A Donatist subgroup known as the Circumcilians made it their mission to attack Catholic clergy and destroy church buildings, which is why Augustine eventually supported state suppression for the movement. As reported by Augustine, we too have nothing but misery here. For instead of the barbarians, we have the Circumcilians, and it is an open question which is the worst of the two. They murder and burn everywhere, throw lime and vinegar in the eyes of our priests. Only yesterday I heard of 48 helpless persons who were compelled to submit to Donatist rebaptism in this place. So while killing Catholics was a favorite pastime, the principal aim of the Circumcilians was the destruction of Catholic churches, Bible manuscripts, and sacred objects. If Landmarkis were logically consistent, spoiler alert, they're not, this will make the Catholic Church the true church, since they were persecuted, their churches destroyed, and their sacred books burned. So let's pull all of this together. The Novatians weren't Baptists. They were Catholic hardliners who upheld apostolic succession, episcopal polity, infant baptism, baptismal regeneration. They rejected eternal security or once saved, always saved, but they broke away from the Catholic Church because they didn't want to forgive people who had lapsed under persecution. The Donatists weren't Baptists either. They believed exactly what the rest of the church believed, except they also believed that a morally flawed bishop couldn't validly administer the sacraments. If you're calling these guys Baptists just because they got mad and left the church, then you might as well add Judas Iscariot to your trail of blood. And if every schism makes you a Baptist, then that means Arius, Pelagius, Nestorius, and the devil himself are honorary members too. Novatian and Donatists didn't reject Catholic theology. They just couldn't stand the Catholic Church's mercy. That's not a church. It's a sanctimonious splinter group. And if these guys are your spiritual ancestors, then it's probably time that you ask yourself what type of family tree you're defending. In the next episode, we're headed into the medieval era to take a look at a few more groups that are often co-opted by the Landmarkis narrative: the Paulicians, the Bogomils, and the Cathars. Very radical sects with wildly different beliefs that are all claimed as real Baptists by people who've never read what these groups taught and who think that heresy equals heritage. Until then, like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment to let me know you're here, and may the good Lord bless you and keep you.